Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are coming up on the end of the semester. And so I just want to kind of call your attention to a couple of things before we get into our content for today. First and foremost, the reflections 6 through 10 written reflections are due on reading day. So they'll be due by midnight of reading day, and there is a place to submit those at the top of the course page, an assignment link there. In addition to that, be aware that you have asynchronous content for this week, which is week 14 on the course page. And this will be your last discussion. I'm asking you to do just like a quick bit of research on divorce and remarriage, and you will see some kind of key issues that come out of just a quick Google search. You'll see lots of information related to divorce and religion, lots of information and resources surrounding the legal aspects of divorce, and then also resources related to financial planning. So a quick, written response that kind of highlights the main points related to each of those ideas is what's expected of you for this week. And again, that will be your last asynchronous work for the course. Before we come back together next week, I will post a final sort of study guide just to kind of give you like overarching concepts and things that you need to be aware of and planning for the final. And the final will be a written exam. It will be posted to the course page prior to reading day, and then I will have it be due at the point at which our final exam is listed. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the exam schedule for this class yet, but you'll have some time to complete that online at your own pace. Mama. Sorry about that. Any questions on any of that information? Okay, and that will bring us up to the end of the course. So today I kind of wanted to start out by just reflecting back on what you looked at asynchronously last week. So there was a chapter related to work, family, and relationships. And then I posted a video about work-family balance, or kind of the lack thereof. Does anyone have any takeaways from that they'd be willing to share, either out loud or using the chat feature?
I just found it interesting that there's actually like a name for overworking, like overwork. I wouldn't think there would actually be like a definition for someone who just doesn't really spend any time with their family, but is always working. But I guess it defines enough people that it makes sense. It's just not something you think about actually being studied.
Yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate, and again, it relates back to this thread that we've seen kind of coming through our course all semester. It's an unfortunate byproduct of technology, right? And how ever present it is in our lives. And I can tell you firsthand, I worked as the director of an early childhood program for 10 years. And in that span of time, I went from not having any children of my own to having 2 children of my own. And so, my family development was changing, but there is an expectation, I think. I mean, people would send me text messages at 2 o'clock in the morning And then when I wake up in the morning, you know, and I'm faced with somebody's out sick for the day or whatever, like I'm not available at 2 o'clock in the morning. No one's available at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know? And I know that they woke up sick and just sent the message, but I don't know, you know, there's just this constant sort of layer of pressure related to work that we feel in our homes when we're that connected to the work. And I think there was a picture in the textbook of a couple, you know, on vacation. They're like sitting in their condo at the beach, both with their laptops open. But I was out on a run this weekend up at Cone Manor. And when I got up to the manor house, I was struck by how many people, like we're outdoors, you know, surrounded by nature and this beautiful house. And there were like 3 or 4 people on the front stoop of the house on their cell phones. I'm like, what, what are we doing here, people? But that's it, you know. I mean, I don't know if they were checking email, or one of the women was researching Moses Cone and kind of like reading off information about him. But I thought, you're kind of missing the moment when you're like up here surrounded by all of this and you're researching the history of Moses Cone on your phone at that time. But yeah, I think it's, you know, it's just this kind of ever-present thing. And we have to be really clear about setting boundaries between our work life and our home life to be successful in managing both of those, for sure.
I was thinking when I was reading it about the Everwork, my parents both work from home and they own their own business. And because their work is in the house, my mom has a really hard time letting herself have like any downtime, because my stepdad thinks that if you're at home, you need to be working because home is work.
Yeah.
And so she'll like be, you know, she's like, do I ever get to just sit and watch TV, or do I need to come down to the office?
Yeah.
It's just like constant work. And when they're not working, they're talking about work. It's just like constantly.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's an interesting kind of shift that has happened, definitely as a byproduct of COVID. But it's kind of the way of the world now. You know, we're all operating in this kind of virtual space where there is a lot more potential to work remotely and to be at home while we're doing our thing. I struggle with that now, with kind of, and I, you know, it's hard for me to, I do have like this room is kind of my office. This is where I come to do my homework for my doctoral work. And then I try to keep it sort of separate from my other spaces of my house, because I think that helps me cognitively distinguish, like, you know, working versus being in the home. But that's definitely another component of it all that has probably shifted for a lot of folks here in the last couple of years, especially. And then I think someone put in the chat, this video made them think about, you know, maternity and paternity leave. And that again is a topic that has come up in a couple of our conversations now, how the infrastructure of our workforce is not necessarily supportive of families, particularly families trying to raise young children. Lots of issues kind of tangled up in that, maternity and paternity leave being foundational, and then, you know, childcare and lots of other family support systems that could be done better, for sure. Any other thoughts or ideas on this? I think at the end of the day, just kind of being aware, you know, that these issues are what they are, and then that, you know, that will help you sort of navigate this work-life balance. And I've heard it said in another context that, you know, balance, this idea of like family and work coming out to be equal all the time, isn't necessarily attainable or even ideal, right? But this idea of harmony, rather than striving for balance, that we might strive for a harmonious relationship between the different things that we have going on in our lives. That might be a more accessible and, you know, maybe it might serve us better to look at things from that lens rather than trying to balance and juggle the different aspects of our lives. So today we're moving into talking about stress and crisis, how stress and crisis show up in families, and we'll look at resiliency and what kind of helps us as individuals to bounce back from stress or crisis as well. Getting the PowerPoint open now. So this is coming from chapter 14 of the textbook. Basically, I want to define stress and crisis because they are not necessarily the same thing. So stress is a reaction to substantial or unusual demands that is felt in the body. Okay, effects of stress can be emotional. That looks like irritability, upset. They can be physical in the form of high blood pressure, fatigue, other physical symptoms, headaches, sometimes associated with stress, or they can be psychological. So depression, anxiety, things like that. On average, most people in the United States report being moderately stressed. There was a 2016 study done on a national sample of folks ranging from 25 to 64 years old. And on a scale of 0 to 6, the average stress score given was a 4.5. So the majority of us are more stressed than not. And so it becomes really important to think about, how do we then promote resiliency, and kind of what are some protective factors to help us manage stress. Madison, do you have a question?
Yes. Can you tell me again how stress is defined, like in contrast to crisis?
Yeah. So, and I'll give a definition of crisis in just a second, but stress is looked at more as a process or a state of being. So we are in this state of stress, right? And then crisis is actually a marked event that occurs in a person's life that can create stress. But crisis is also defined as upsetting the normal functioning of a family. So loss of a loved one, loss of a spouse, that is an acute crisis that occurs. It upsets the day-to-day functioning of the family, and then it creates this process of stress that a person has to pass through. And that stress might look like the initial reaction to the crisis, so that initial loss, and then all of the planning and things that have to go into end of life matters. And then there's this grief and adjustment period as we move forward in a relationship with a partner who has passed away, or loss of a child or something like that. That's an example of a crisis that contributes to stress in the family and in the person's life. I want to go back and point out that there has been a lot of research done on how stress shows up in families. And one kind of interesting way is that stress has implications for children's diets. So children who are living in homes with parents who are experiencing stress tend to consume fewer fruits and vegetables. And so if you think about that kind of from from a short-term and a long-term perspective, that has implications for that child's development over time. And it also has, it's just kind of a way to give kind of a tangible experience, I guess, to, when parents are experiencing stress, it shows up in the family in these kind of interesting ways, in that, they might not be spending as much time at home, or engaging in, parental behaviors like preparing healthy meals and things like that. But it's something to, again, be aware of, and to kind of know that what's happening at one level in the family has kind of a trickle down effect to impacts on children as well. And so then stress and crisis occur, and how do we respond to those in a way that helps us successfully navigate life challenges, that's called resiliency. Resilience is our strength and our ability to, successfully respond to stress or crisis. Lots of things influence family resilience. There is this idea of reframing. It's a cognitive practice that we'll look at a little bit more later on in our talk today. And then the idea of partnering with family members, working together to navigate stress and crisis. I think a lot of times the tendency, especially when you think about something like loss of a child, the tendency is sometimes for partners to isolate from one another, to close off emotionally, where that actually, contributes to more stress in the home. And if partners would come together and try to face that crisis in partnership, that would contribute to more of a resilient response to that crisis. And then the idea of being flexible when we are all faced with challenges and things that we kind of have to adapt to. And so the work is in figuring out how do we move forward in a positive way after a stressful life event has occurred. And I guess before I move on to this visual of family stress coping, I do also want to point out that there are life events that are positive and they cause stress, right? So the birth of a child, embarking on a new career. Not all stress is necessarily negative in nature. It becomes negative when A, we don't have the coping skills to deal with it, or B, when it is prolonged and goes on for so long that it becomes this kind of like toxic level of stress. But there are also positive stressors. So this is a model from your textbook, the family stress coping model. And what I want you to see is that the stressful event, A, B, which is our coping skills or our community resources, things that we can tap into, and C, which is our kind of cognitive work around the stress event, our appraisal and perception of what has happened. All of these three things are very interrelated and they're cyclical in nature rather than linear. So there's this kind of back and forth interplay between the stress that has occurred, how we appraise that situation and how we cope with that situation, that eventually over time results in this X, which is outside the model. And that's called our adaptation, or our family's adaptation to what has occurred. Generally speaking, our job in supporting stress management with families, unless we're a professional, working in the mental health field, is going to be providing support as either a family member ourselves or as a friend. And so knowing those resources in your community that exist that you can point people to help make referrals to professionals and other agencies is a really important kind of piece of understanding family stress and how to promote resiliency. So some other stress management or resiliency strategies include this positive perspective taking. So this is what I referred to earlier as reframing. There's an example given in your book about survivors of natural disasters who lose their homes, their jobs. Those folks might choose to focus on the fact that they still have their family members, even though they have lost material possessions. That's an example of cognitive reframing, where you're kind of trying to find the good in a really, negative or traumatic situation. But taking that perspective is a really important way to help promote resiliency to crisis and stress. Following through with behaviors. So understanding, what types of behaviors are supportive to you in managing your stress, in navigating challenges is one thing, right? And then actually doing those things is another matter. So follow through with behavior, and, you know, recognizing what might work and then actually doing that work is another important stress management strategy. The term dyadic coping refers back to what I talked about with partnership, and working together with people in the family rather than isolating, and being supportive of one another during stressful life events. Dyadic refers to two people, but that's the idea of couples coming together. Excuse me. Daily exercise. The Center for Disease Control, CDC, recommends for people over the age of 6, at least 30 minutes of light to moderate physical activity every day. And so this has physical benefits, obviously, but it also has cognitive and emotional benefits that we might not necessarily think of. And I think as adults in our society, we have to be really intentional to kind of carve this into our day-to-day, right? We are primarily a sedentary people. We most of the time sit at work, and we drive everywhere. And if we want to get 30 minutes of intentional exercise in a day, we have to kind of make that happen. And I think, you know, recognizing that that's a way to manage stress, especially when you're facing challenging life events, can be a really important way to support yourself. Social media. So we've talked about this kind of ad nauseum at this point, but there's a lot of research out there that suggests that the more social media you consume, the higher your rates of depression, anxiety, unhappiness will be. So again, you know, knowing that there's this correlational relationship between social media consumption and mental and emotional wellness is important. And then kind of understanding how to navigate that in your own life. Religion and spirituality, really important to stress management. Religion is not necessarily the thing. It is the thing for some people, but spirituality, so a connection with something outside of ourselves, is really important for everyone, right? And so understanding that it's not necessarily what you believe, but that you believe in something, and then kind of finding ways to connect with that can be really important to helping you navigate stress. And finally, lightheartedness, proper sleep hygiene, and time with pets. Even exposure to pets that are not yours can be very, it can be a protective factor. I went with my children last week to an animal shelter, and we just like spent some time with cats and dogs, and it was refreshing. And of course, my children want a kitten now. But, you know, just that time spent kind of being of service, feeding animals, and engaging with animals is useful to us. Examples on this slide of what family crises might look like. And these are all pretty straightforward. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about infidelity, but any type of physical illness that kind of upsets the day-to-day family routine, mental illness, midlife crisis, that's a thing that some people pass through, and it can have significant implications for you know, financial stress, marital strain, all of those types of things can come out of a midlife crisis experience. Poverty and unemployment, substance use and abuse, death of a family member is reported as one of the key family crisis examples, and then infidelity in a relationship. There are various types of infidelity that can occur. So physical infidelity, there can also be, you know, emotional infidelity. The text offers a number of reasons why infidelity might occur. I just really want to talk about this this notion called the Coolidge effect, right? So this is a term in the literature given to describe the waning of sexual excitement and then the effect of novelty and variety on sexual arousal. So if you think back to our previous discussions about sexual activity in early marriage, we see this peak kind of at the 1 year mark and then a sharp decline in sexual activity after that point. That sharp decline could be related to this Coolidge effect, right? Where the excitement of the newness of the relationship and the variety, all of that stuff has kind of worn off, and people began to seek excitement and novelty outside the marital relationship. And so that is thought to be a reason that infidelity in the relationship can occur. And then your textbook offers a variety of ways to kind of understand recovery from infidelity. I think that the biggest piece of that, again, is partnership, working together, and some of these other things that we've talked about, cognitive reframing, being willing to move forward in a new and adapted way in the relationship. Yeah, Madison.
Are there studies about relationships that have experienced infidelity, like them getting back together? Like, what are the rates of the infidelity happening again?
Yeah, that's a kind of a whole body of research, and it's outside my wheelhouse for sure, but I can say from anecdotal experience, I think it goes one of two ways. It either strengthens the relationship and it becomes this kind of marked place where, there was like almost a falling apart and then a building back up, maybe on a stronger foundation of trust and communication and things like that. Or it tends to have the complete opposite effect, where it's really something that people, because they don't pass through these phases of recovery in maybe a healthy way, and they, are holding on to the past or not talking openly about what has happened, then it kind of has that opposite effect where it becomes something that the relationship doesn't recover from. And I don't know the data around how often it happens again, but I'm certain that it happens more in relationships where people are not partnering with one another in those like really important, emotional ways. And so that's all I think related to open communication and honesty and things like that. Any other questions or thoughts on infidelity as an issue in relationships? And so then, and this marriage and family therapy, important probably for relationships that have passed through infidelity as an issue, but lots of other issues can emerge where marriage and family therapy could be really supportive for a relationship. So it's important just to be aware there are lots of different types of marriage and family therapy. It is generally effective when both partners kind of show up to do the work, right? And I think the most successful marriage and family therapy tends to have an individual component where, each person is meeting with the therapist kind of on their own, and then also coming together to do work, as a couple on their relationship. I'm opening the textbook to page 315 because there's an example on page 315 of this behavioral contract. So this is an idea that can come out of marriage and family therapy work, where like the example in the text says, number 1, no negative statements are made to the partner. Number 2, compliment the partner twice each day. Number 3, hug or hold a partner once a day. And number 4, go out to dinner with each other on Saturday nights. And then it's just a check sheet, like through the week you would do this work and check it off. And it's a behavioral contract that both partners are entering into. It seems really contrived and maybe artificial, but if you think about, you know, if you're in a relationship with someone and you've gotten to the point where you're never saying positive things to one another, you're not engaging in physical touch and some of those things that are just really important for like the foundation of a relationship to exist upon, then putting something like this, excuse me, into place can kind of help you maybe get over the hump and move back into doing this in a more authentic and natural way after you've kind of committed to doing it just because you've said you'll do it, right? But behavioral contracts are just one element of marriage and family therapy. We've talked earlier on, I think in the semester, about, you know, communication tactics, and there's a lot of work that can be done here to help support both you as a person and you as a partner in a relationship. And there's a really important quote from the text that I put on this slide, just because I think it really speaks to the whole idea that if you don't have time to work on your marriage, you're going to have to make time to work through your divorce. Marriage is one of those things that is kind of a constant, I mean, it requires constant work and checking in and making sure that you're not just letting things kind of go. Someone said in the chat, their parents have a thing where they go on a date every week, and then they go on a vacation, just the two of them, every couple of months. I'm sure, Catherine, that contributes to a stronger relationship between the two of them. And I think that idea of dating your partner, no matter how long they've been your partner, is so important, you know, and it's something that doesn't happen naturally. We kind of have to make that happen in the same way that we make time to exercise or do any of those self-care type of things. Anything else that anybody wants to share on any of what we've talked about thus far? All right, I have a quick, it's like a 7-minute video. This is from a mom who experienced the loss of a child. And so she's talking about resiliency and these kind of 3 key factors that promoted resiliency for her in her life and her ability to accept her circumstances. I'll share it really quickly and then we'll kind of just debrief on it before we go.
3 strategies that underpin all of my work.
Sorry, give me 1 second. Can you see that now?
And they're pretty readily available to us all. Anyone can learn them. You can learn them right here today. So number 1, resilient people get that shit happens. They know that suffering is part of life. This doesn't mean they actually welcome it in. They're not actually delusional, just that when the tough times come, they seem to know that suffering is part of every human existence. And knowing this stops you from feeling discriminated against when the tough times come. Never once did I find myself thinking, why me? In fact, I remember thinking, why not me? Terrible things happen to you just like they do everybody else. That's your life now, time to sink or swim. The real tragedy is that not enough of us seem to know this any longer. We seem to live in an age where we're entitled to a perfect life, where shiny, happy photos on Instagram are the norm, when actually, as you all demonstrated at the start of my talk, the very opposite is true. Number 2, resilient people are really good at choosing carefully where they select their attention. They have a habit of realistically appraising situations and typically managing to focus on the things that they can change and somehow accept the things that they can't. This is a vital, learnable skill for resilience. As humans, we are really good at noticing threats and weaknesses. We are hardwired for that negative. We're really, really good at noticing them. Negative emotions stick to us like Velcro, whereas positive emotions and experiences seem to bounce off like Teflon. Being wired in this way is actually really good for us and served us well from an evolutionary perspective. So imagine for a moment I'm a cave woman and I'm coming out of my cave in the morning. There's a saber-toothed tiger on one side and a beautiful rainbow on the other. It kind of pays for my survival for me to notice this tiger. The problem is we now live in an era where we are constantly bombarded by threats all day long. And our poor brains treat every single one of those threats as though they were a tiger. Our threat focus, our stress response is permanently dialed up. Resilient people don't diminish the negative, but they also have worked out a way of tuning into the good. One day, when doubts were threatening to overwhelm me, I distinctly remember thinking, no, you do not get to get swallowed up by this. You have to survive. You've got so much to live for. Choose life, not death. Don't lose what you have to what you have lost. In psychology, we call this benefit finding. In my brave new world, it involved trying to find things to be grateful for. At least our wee girl hadn't died of some terrible, long, drawn-out illness. She died suddenly, instantly, sparing us and her that pain. We had a huge amount of social support from family and friends to help us through. And most of all, we still had two beautiful boys to live for who needed us now and deserved to have as normal a life as we could possibly give them. Being able to switch the focus of your attention to also include the good has been shown by science to be a really powerful strategy. So in 2005, Marty Seligman and colleagues conducted an experiment, and they asked people, all they asked people to do was think of 3 good things that had happened to them each day. What they found over the 6-month course of this study was that those people showed higher levels of gratitude, higher levels of happiness, and less depression over the course of the 6-month study. When you're going through grief, you might need a reminder, or you might need permission to feel grateful. In our kitchen, we've got a bright pink neon poster that reminds us to accept the good. In the American Army, they framed it a little bit differently. They talked to the army about hunting the good stuff. Find the language that works for you, but whatever you do, make an intentional, deliberate, ongoing effort to tune into what's good in your world. Number 3, resilient people ask themselves, is what I'm doing helping or harming me? This is a question that's used a lot in good therapy. And boy, is it powerful. This was my go-to question in the days after the girls died. I would ask it again and again. Should I go to the trial and see the driver? Would that help me or would it harm me? Well, that was a no-brainer for me. I chose to stay away. But Trevor, my husband, decided to meet with the driver at a later time. Late at night, I'd find myself sometimes poring over old photos of Abby, getting more and more upset. I'd ask myself, really? Is this helping you or is it harming you? Put away the photos, go to bed for the night, be kind to yourself. This question can be applied to so many different contexts. Is the way I'm thinking and acting helping or harming you in your big to get that promotion, to pass that exam, to recover from a heart attack. So many different ways. I write a lot about resilience, and over the years, this one strategy has prompted more positive feedback than any other. I get scores of letters and emails and things from all over the place of people saying what a huge impact it's had on their lives. Whether it is forgiving family, ancient transgressions, arguments from Christmases past, or whether it is just trawling through social media, whether it is asking yourself whether you really need that extra glass of wine, asking yourself whether what you're doing, the way you're thinking, the way you're acting is helping or harming you, puts you back in the driver's seat. It gives you some control over your decision making. 3 strategies, pretty simple. They're readily available to us all.
All right, so what stood out to you from what you just heard her share? Unmute or use the chat feature, whichever you're more comfortable with.
I'm like grateful about writing down things that you're grateful about. A few months ago, I've gotten out of the habit, and actually during the video, I set a reminder on my phone to do it again. But at night, I would write down 5 things that I was grateful for. And even if I had like a day where it seems like nothing, I would write like, books or something, even if it's small. But I think that it would put things in perspective to write down 3 things good that had happened to me, like that had actually happened to me that day. So I definitely think that these are like easy steps that we could do.
And I think, you bring up a good point that we don't have to wait until we're facing stress and crisis to bolster our mental wellness and our emotional wellness, right? We can put some of these practices into place kind of as a proactive measure to make sure that we are, and she mentioned in the video that she was talking about, that finding the good, or benefit finding is what she called it, that is a learnable skill. And so this kind of practice of doing it and, cultivating that in our lives helps us more easily access that type of thinking when we are faced with stress and crisis. So yeah, a great thing to just have as a part of your life. And you can buy planners, journals. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff out there because there's a lot of research that supports this for, productivity, mental wellness. There's a lot of benefits to putting your gratitudes and benefits down on paper, for sure. I see Callie raised a hand.
Yeah, I do the same thing that Madison does, but I say it's a what went well that day. So it's like a 3W thing. And it definitely helps me to be like more aware of what things had to happen that were good compared to like, no matter what happened that was bad that day, like I still want to end the day focusing on what went well. And what can help me in the future. So
yeah. And, I've done this. I don't do it consistently all the time, but I've done it for years as a practice. And so sometimes I'll find an old journal. I have one sitting right here where it's interesting to look back at, 3 years ago, what were my 3 gratitudes for the day? And I'm very specific about them, right? Like a headspace meditation before bed. I played Frisbee with my dogs and I did yoga in the sun a couple years ago in May. But I can almost access like those memories and take me back to kind of that positive experience. So I think it's a really good thing. And I like that what went well idea. We do that at the dinner table with my children too. We call it the pit and the peak of our day. We do what was kind of the highlight of the day and then what was a challenge. And sometimes that's an opportunity for us to talk with our children about how to, process and or problem solve around challenges that they face during their day too. So That's another practice. Someone said, I give myself a 5-minute rule so that if something will not have a major impact on my life in 5 years, then I don't allow myself to be upset about it for more than 5 minutes. I think that's really great to think about perspective taking. And I often do that too, like, will this matter in even a year? And sometimes the answer is like, no, not at all. And so I like that 5 and 5, though. That's a nice little parameter to set. And something else that came from the video someone put in the chat is that it's okay to grieve, but that you also have to move forward. And this mother had other children to consider, in the video. So, but we all have things that come up in our lives. And we have other people and, things that need us to keep moving forward. And someone said, heal from the sadness and negative emotion, even as you think about them. And I think another important piece that she mentioned in the video related to grief and this idea of, benefits finding is that doesn't come naturally when you're in the grieving process. She mentioned acceptance twice in 2 contexts, right? Acceptance of the shit that happens in your life and recognizing that we are not unique when bad things do happen, but also accepting the good, right? And knowing that even though something bad has happened to us, there is still good that can come to us. And so finding and recognizing that even in that state of grief and sadness is really important. And then that whole concept of, is it helpful or hurtful? I use that language a lot when I'm working with young children. Is this helpful or hurtful, to another person, to our community? And then I think applying that to yourself. And one thing that I do want to point out related to that when she was talking in the video is she said, for her, when she asked herself, do I want to go to the trial and see the driver who hit and killed my children? Is that helpful or hurtful? The answer was a no-brainer. She said she did not want to go, but notice that she said her husband did. And so I think recognizing that even in partnership where we are both experiencing the same crisis, we are not going to respond to that crisis in the same way as our partner or as another individual. And so, again, it goes back to open communication, empathy, understanding this is where I'm at, this is where you're at, and it's okay if we navigate this in kind of a different way, is really important to that idea of partnering together as a way to promote resiliency in the relationship. Any other thoughts or final ideas on this?
I think the like the helpful versus hurtful language, I kind of disagree with that a little bit, just because sometimes if people are asking, well, is that helpful or hurtful? There's kind of like a bad connotation, or they could say it to shame you. I think like what you were saying, working with children, that's like a really simple, good thing to do. But like sometimes when you're like, I don't know, like if a partner, when she was talking about the drinking thing, like, should I have this, is this extra glass of wine helpful or hurtful? I think thinking that to yourself is one thing, but if a partner said that, it would like, if a partner said that to me, that would not be, that would not be good.
That would not be helpful, right?
My stress. That would not be, that would not be good for me getting through something,
Sure.
especially a trauma. Like that would not be, I would not be okay with that. So I don't know. I just think some like that language sometimes can give a little bit of shame. And that's not what you want when you're healing. That's terrible to feel when you're healing. But yeah, I mean, she made some really good points, but it's really important to, yes, be empathetic, because it's really like you really shame is a horrible thing. So
yeah, I agree. And I definitely agree that it's never our place in a partnership to manage another person's emotions or their emotional responses, right? Our place is to acknowledge those emotions and responses, to validate that they are happening for that other person, and then to do our own work around how we're going to respond to the person's emotional response. So it's not my place to tell my husband that he's having too much wine as a reaction to anything in life, you know. It's my place to do the work around, you know, how do I feel about that, and how do I show up in a partnership with someone, you know, engaging in whatever the behavior is. Totally agree. And shaming another person or shaming us ourselves is not a useful tool, right? So yeah, I think the language of, is this helping me or is this hurting me, could be a really good way for us to cue in on, how is this behavior, like what's the function, how's it operating in my experience. But if it gets to the point where you were doing a lot of negative self-talk or shaming yourself, then that's also not going to serve you. I totally agree. Someone mentioned giving yourself grace, and then trying to make choices that are going to benefit you or be helpful to you, for sure. Because I think, yeah, I mean, especially when we're talking about responses to trauma and things like that, grace is such a key element, extending that to other people and also offering it to ourselves. And then, yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sure, Mackenzie, to your point, it comes when we do try to bring someone else's attention to negative behaviors or negative emotional responses, it comes from a place of good intent, I would say, most of the time. But again, you know, if there's one thing that I've learned in life and in marriage in general, it's that I am only responsible for myself. I'm not responsible for my husband. I'm not responsible for my children's behavior. Oftentimes when, you know, I have a 4-year-old, she just turned 4, and she can tantrum like with the best of them. And I have to do my own work around that. I have to say to myself, like, my job is not to stop her tantrum. My job is not to do anything but to be here. And there's nothing wrong with me, and there's nothing wrong with her. And I'm just responsible for my own reactions and responses to her behavior, not for her behavior itself. So I think that same idea can be applied to partner relationships as well. So, any other thoughts, final words? A lot of conflict during times like this. Yep. Because of that emotionality that's happening, Kelsey mentioned, everyone is kind of fragile in times of stress and crisis. And, you know, our tendency is not to be empathetic or gentle or responsive. I think it's a really important distinction to make between reacting and responding, right? So reactions happen on the fly really quickly. We don't take time to pause and process and think through what we're going to say. And when we're in this heightened state of emotion, we are very reactive. Whereas a response is a thoughtful, you know, paused, well-articulated response to something that has happened. And it's much less emotional in nature than a reaction. So thinking, am I being responsive or am I being reactive, could also be beneficial. Yes, using soft emotions and emotional regulation. You know, I'm talking about it in the context of my just turned 4-year-old, but that's work that we spend the rest of our lives doing, right? Is learning how to regulate ourselves and how to show up with other people in a way that is responsive and emotionally sound. And speaking of emotional little people, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you for the kind words. And if you will take a minute to type your name in the chat, everybody's on Zoom now. Thank you all for your time and for being here. I'll see you next week for our last call. And I'll send out an email just to kind of recap on everything in terms of due dates and final and things like that, so that we'll all be on the same page. Okay, take good care. Bye. Be resilient.